All right, welcome everyone. We are going to get started. I'm going to share my screen. This week we are talking about gender. Let's see here. All right, jump right in. So, of course, we need to define the terms that we are using. So, here are two big terms in the chapter that are used. The first is sex, and the second is gender. And often, previously, we used these interchangeably, but in more recent years, there has been some issues with using these interchangeably because people identify as different genders, and it doesn't really depend upon the sex of their biology that they're born with. So you're born with a certain amount of biology or certain type of biology, and from there, doctors determine whether you are male or female. There are certain, I don't want to say disorders, but body differences when someone has both male and female reproductive parts, or just male or just female, but they have those reproductive organs, but they have the opposite outside sex. So they're on the outside, they look like a female, and they have, breasts and all of that, and on the inside they have male type body parts in their body. So that's why it's hard sometimes to differentiate, quote unquote, what people are, because there are some differences biologically. But for the most part, people are born as one sex, whether male or female. And what happens as a societal change in more recent years, but it's always been about, is this idea of gender, and that I get to identify myself what I see myself as. So this is more cultural, social, psychological meaning that is associated more so with masculinity and femininity. All right. Gender roles. So in the 1950s, this idea was very apparent. And this was something that we had in our discussion post a couple weeks ago. And from the 1950s to the 60s and 70s, slowly there have been some changes, sometimes because society was realizing that women had more to offer, or and also women had more opportunities, and that had to do with World War I and World War II, as everyone, all the soldiers were sent off, all the young men were sent off to fight, and the women had to kind of keep jobs running while these things were happening, these events were happening. From there, it kind of adapted into, okay, we need to include males and females, and this eventually became more obsolete. Now, I know I personally still see gender roles, and to define gender roles, it's behaviors, attitudes, and traits designated as masculine or feminine in a culture based on gender stereotypes. So, for example, my mom raised all of us as kids. My father was gone all the time, and he worked. And this seemed very concurrent with the time period. When we had people over, they often had this similar setup. But in recent years, my dad has actually stopped working. He's retired. He does a lot of the chores and the cleaning around the house, while my mom now goes to work. So they kind of showed that at first they were kind of conforming to gender roles, but as their relationship grew and changed, it became more obvious that they had their own specific roles that they wanted to play, and whether or not it fit into these gender roles. So gender stereotypes often perpetuate this idea of gender roles. So a woman has to be at home in the kitchen. So then often people associate this with typical woman feminine behavior. So if a male stays home with the kids, it's seen as feminine. So this male must be more feminine, instead of it just being something that someone does. So and in that way it can kind of change the attitude and how people perceive these types of things and how they perceive themselves and the role they place in society. Okay. So we also have gender identity, and this is this psychological sense of being male or female. And I say this as I am not going to go into too much detail of the LGBTQ plus community. This is just gender as it's identified as male and female. And that's just because I do not have enough knowledge to do LGBTQ plus in a way that would be authentic and true to their experience. But I can give these general terms so that everyone can kind of be on the same page of what these terms mean. Okay. So a person's sexual orientation is the direction of your emotional and erotic attraction to opposite, same, or both sexes. So this has to do with your sexual attraction, sexual orientation, but it does not have to align with your gender identity. So a female gender identity could be attracted to women, could be attracted to men and women, or a female identity could be attracted to just men. So these two are very distinct ideas that are different from each other. Okay, so there's also this idea of the gender continuum. And I think this is, especially with more current research, this is where our world is kind of heading into. So cisgender is a term used to describe individuals whose genders match their biological sex. Transgender, a term used to describe individuals whose gender does not match their biological sex. Genderqueer or gender non-binary, kind of an umbrella term. Gender fluid, an individual who may identify as male, female, both, or neither at different times and in different circumstances. So, for example, perhaps there is a woman who is growing up and she wears dresses and she really aligns with her feminine side, and then she enters the workforce and she ends up conforming more to masculinity and appreciating that masculinity side, and may then identify as more male than female at that point. Okay. So this idea is we have this gender continuum from masculinity to femininity, and people can identify along this continuum or be fluid among this continuum. All right. So now let's talk about gender differences. Are they real? So do gender roles actually exist? Do people conform to gender roles specifically? And are there some gender stereotypes? All right. Okay, so what kind of behaviors do you attribute to girls and what kind do you kind of attribute to boys? So this is just general ideas or stereotypes that people have. I am not saying that this is true or false at this point. So girls are more likely to agree with a person that they are talking to. They may offer praise. They may elaborate on others' comments. Boys are more likely to assert their opinions, offer criticism, engage in aggression. Now, this does not mean that this is that this was actual research found. This is just general stereotypes that we often view with girls and boys. So, what are the actual gender differences? So, in terms of language and language skills, so talking with other people, girls develop language skills earlier and know more words, but it doesn't translate into long-term differences. So that means that by middle school, in high school, they're kind of on the same ground of being able to develop these language skills. In terms of temperament, boys may be less likely to suppress inappropriate responses. And with respect to aggression, boys may have higher rates of unprovoked physical aggression than girls, but no difference in provoked aggression. Sorry, I'm trying to keep my dog currently from squeaking this very obnoxious toy, but she is not having it. So I apologize. Okay. Now, let's take a look at this. So this is the actual results of the differences between males and females and how they differ. So often our gender stereotypes paint these huge differences, but this is in actuality how our differences are. So that means, if you see these two lines, the differences are not significant enough to really say one way or another. And also, perhaps girls are more prone to maybe being talkative because they're often encouraged to be talkative. Or perhaps boys are encouraged to be more aggressive in society because boys will be boys and you have to stand up for yourself. And those types of characteristics are often accentuated with boys versus girls. So this graph shows the average difference in self-esteem in particular between girls and boys. And this is something that is common across the board with all the differences, is this tiny little sloped difference between the two, and not enough to actually provide some significance. So for it to actually hold up to multiple studies. So this means that knowing someone's gender does not help much in predicting his or her actual traits. So, and yet again, research has shown that girls are not more fearful, shy, or scared of new things than boys. Boys do not perform better at math than girls. Girls are not more talkative than boys. This is from an article authored by Hyde in 2005. So, so what all of this means and what you can take from it is that two things. The first is that we are often the product of our environment. If we grow up in an environment that tells us to act a certain way because of who we are, then we are more likely to adopt those traits. Two, even with that being said, there are still not significant differences found in between genders. This means that even with nature and nurture working together, even with nurture, and stereotypes and all those things kind of coming out, it does not, is not a big enough difference to say that it's not just nurturing. So there is a lot to be said about, girls not pursuing math, or maybe not focusing on math as a positive trait, and that's more so because of the nurturing that they may receive. That it's better for boys to have more intelligence in math than girls, and this is just through research with teachers and developing young minds and all of that. The research suggests that teachers come in with preconceived biases and may act on them, whether malicious or not, more likely not malicious, but just thinking that they are helping the female, when in fact the female may be able to complete, this higher levels of math and do very well. So with that being said, we have a progression chart here between 1 year old to 8 or 9 years old. So 1 year old can distinguish a face by the specific gender. This means that when people suggest that gender doesn't come into the mind of the child unless it's shown it actually, the child starts learning the differences between faces and gender at 1 year old, and then at 2 years old they can pick up different labels of genders and can sort objects into gender categories. 3 years old can identify their own gender, and they often have the tendency to believe that sex is determined by external attributes. So what this means is that they come to this conclusion through their environment, through interacting with themselves and others, and so then it's up to parents to kind of begin that idea of what is identity, what is gender fluidity, what is all these different questions. And so you see at around 9 years old, kiddos begin to be more flexible in these gender stereotypes. They start to develop kind of their awareness of other types of genders, and just that there are different belief systems. Okay. So there's also something called developmental intergroup theory. So often adults' heavy focus on gender can lead children to use gender as a key source of information about themselves and others. So this is where the depression and anxiety can come in if they believe that they're trying to conform to the gender that they, or the sex that they are assigned at birth, and they believe that those should be the same. And when it doesn't feel like it's the same in your body, and that can create a lot of anxiety. They may seek out any possible gender differences and often will form rigid stereotypes based on gender. And this is just to keep that schema of what gender is alive in their minds, to help create this focus on gender specifically. So gender schema theory. Children actually actively organize others' behaviors, activities, and attributes into gender categories, which are known as schemas. This is just a shortcut way of doing things, and it's totally normal and natural for us to do this, but that does not mean it is correct, as in it does not mean that it correctly portrays the outside world and what others are trying to portray. So we may say, oh, this is, in this picture, these are 3 females, but the one in the middle may think I'm with 2 females and I align as a male. So there are these different ideas of how to categorize people, And if we're not careful, we really can become insensitive. And so it's always best to ask and make sure you're using the correct pronouns, things like that. Social learning theory is something that we will learn more about a little later in the course when we learn about all the different types of learning. Gender roles are often learned through reinforcement, punishment, and modeling. That means, the nurturing part, who you align with when you are growing up, who you interact with. If you are reinforced to play with dolls and Barbies as a girl, or if you are punished as a girl when you want to do a sport like kickboxing or shooting. So this is something that aligns that can really affect a child early on. So it's important to always let your child just kind of express themselves however they want to, and leaving those open choices of how they want to interact with their world. If they want, toy cars or toy Barbies or playing dress up, any of those things, just having them kind of free for all to create their life how they want it. Okay. So now we go into gender, sexism, and socialization. So gender discrimination is this idea of differential treatment based on gender. And sexual harassment is this unwanted treatment, related to sexual behaviors or appearance. So treating boys and girls and men and women differently is both a consequence of gender differences and a cause of gender differences. So this idea of kind of believing that everyone conforms to these gender stereotypes and treating the opposite gender as you would in these gender stereotypes. So sexual harassment can consist of being the target of jokes, having their body parts rated, maybe unwanted touching, those types of things. Okay, so a meta-analysis, which is just basically a study of a bunch of different studies of research from the US and Canada, found that parents most frequently treated sons and daughters differently by encouraging gender stereotypical activities. Now, this study was done in 1991, but I think it still proves to be true. So this is a way that nurture is being engaged and kind of predetermining how a child will turn out. Okay, now we have some definitions here. Ambivalent sexism kind of consists of two parts. Let's see here. We have hostile sexism. Right here, show her it's a man's world. This is much more having women to be portrayed as submissive to a male. And then benevolent sexism. Oh, I need to take care of you. I need to make sure that you are safe and okay because you are a poor woman. So hostile is more kind of being more abusive to women, believing that they're lesser than, while benevolent is, while kinder, it is still, I must treat you in a certain way because you are fragile. All right, this is the last slide. And this is kind of a review of key events in the evolution of American sexism and socialization. So this kind of shows a timeline of important events that affected how genders are, kind of the gender process kind of was came out into the limelight and became a focus in America. So 19th Amendment, women's suffrage ratified so that women can vote. World War II forces millions of women to enter a workforce. Another thing, 1963, Congress passes Equal Pay Act. 1969 is the Stonewall riots, and this in New York City, and this club was, I think, a transgender club, and it was about kind of forcing gay rights into the American spotlight. It's a huge stepping stone in the right direction for that. 1973, APA removes homosexuality from the DSM, so it's no longer classified as a mental health disorder. So you can see how the changes in society have also led to the changes in psychology and how we define things. 1987, average women earned 68 cents for every $1 earned by a man. 1992, World Health Organization no longer considers homosexuality an illness. So as you can see, we have progressed, we have improved, but we still have a bit of a way to go. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you guys through Blackboard, and I'll see you next week.